and his longtime ally, Senator Chris Coons, who's focused on African issues, has met with Abe. The Delaware Democrat joins me now from Washington. So, Senator, welcome back to the program. You have just come back from an event at the White House. What can you tell me about how the president is thinking about this issue now in the Horn of Africa?
Well, Christiane, it was encouraging, positive to be over at the White House for a bill signing. President Biden just signed 4 different bipartisan bills to support our veterans. But we had a moment to talk on the side of that event, and he renewed his personal direct message to me that he really hopes those of us in Congress who are actively engaged in supporting democracy and to trying to defend human rights will continue our efforts to pressure, frankly, both the coup leaders in Sudan and the combatants in Ethiopia to step back from the brink. I've introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation here that would sanction individuals in Ethiopia who are accelerating what is an increasingly ethnic-based conflict. Christiane, one of my great concerns to look back at history is that the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, a large nation of 110 million people, a multi-faith, multilingual, multi-ethnic republic, may disintegrate the same way Yugoslavia did, with the same sort of tragic impacts in terms of human rights, hunger, and even possibly genocide.
And you know, because that was our generation's, my generation's war, and we witnessed not just the human rights violations that you talk about, but how it really hampered American foreign policy, Western democratic foreign policy, and became a battleground for so many other countries. What would you tell Americans watching, and frankly, you know, global citizens watching, about why this Horn of Africa region is important to America? What is the history that America looks to?
Well, first, Sudan, which you also just mentioned in the introduction, is a country that for decades was on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. There was a genocide in Darfur within Sudan, one of the largest countries in Africa, and they have just recently emerged. They overthrew their dictator. They were just removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list, and widespread civilian demonstrations succeeded in securing a path towards democracy, which just in the last few weeks has been pushed back by a coup. At a moment around the world when democracies are under real pressure from authoritarianism, we in the United States, who care about democracy and its vibrancy globally, should care about whether or not democracy succeeds in Sudan. In Ethiopia, it's been the breadbasket of the region. It's been a significant contributor of peacekeeping troops in the Horn. They've been a key partner to the United States in combating extremism in Somalia and have helped stabilize Sudan, South Sudan. And there's a large diaspora community here in the United States. To have Ethiopia now suddenly turn, instead of being led by a Peace Prize winning peacemaker who was trying to build a modern democracy, to have that leader and his combatant opponents, the TPLF, now engaged in this death struggle on a field of battle just outside of Addis, is a truly disheartening development that should concern all of us.
Mm-hmm. And of course, TPLF is the name for the military entity of the Tigrayan region. Yes. And as you say, that is fighting now, you know, mired in fighting with the government forces. And as we said in the introduction, I mean, the extraordinary sight of this Peace Prize winner on the actual battlefront in his Ray-Bans and his fatigues, talking about repelling and destroying the enemy. But perhaps even more worryingly for yourself, his spokesman, presumably channeling the Prime Minister, has accused the diaspora in the United States of being behind terrorists, as they call it, seeking regime change against the Abe government, blaming Western governments and, frankly, all but blaming the United States for trying to overthrow the Abe government. What do you say to that? I mean, you've met with him. This doesn't bode well for American efforts to broker some kind of halt to this war.
Christiane, leaders across the continent of Africa, across the world, the Secretary General of the United Nations, former heads of state, current regional heads of state, have all met with Prime Minister Abe and pleaded with him to show his skill as a peacemaker, exactly the sort of capabilities that led to him being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just a few years ago. He is a skilled military officer, someone who served in the Ethiopian Armed Forces for decades, and he is instead today showing that more martial side of his experience and character. When I met with him months ago as President Biden's personal emissary, I was there to urge him to step back from the brink of ethnically based confrontation, and he made a number of very encouraging commitments which he initially kept, but which ultimately have been broken. I recognize that the TPLF fired first, that they launched a war against federal bases and armed forces up in Tigray, but both sides have accelerated this. Regional players have been invited in, and this war has gotten absolutely out of hand. And the Prime Minister has the ability to call for a ceasefire, to negotiate, and to seek a resolution to this conflict before millions die from both violence and starvation. I think he has an opportunity here to show that he earned the Peace Prize based on his commitment to peacemaking rather than what is currently the path he's on. Last point, if I could, Christiane, social media is playing a critical role here, helping to accelerate some of the ethnic-based language and activities that are happening here that are very concerning. This is a tinderbox, a region that if it goes up, could have real consequences, not just in Ethiopia, but throughout the region, and frankly, in some ways, the world.
And you mentioned the humanitarian crisis. I think perhaps one of the things many people in the world remember is the 1984 famine in Ethiopia, which then led to Live Aid. People remember those kinds of human catastrophes. And if that happens again, it would indeed be a catastrophe. But I just want to ask you again, why do you think this government is pointing at the United States as backing what they call terrorists and seeking Abiy's overthrow? Does that, I mean, why would they be doing that?
Well, in a number of meetings that I had, both in Addis in person months ago and subsequent conversations, the narrative of the Ethiopian government is that there are Americans, both Republicans and Democrats at senior levels in our government, who are taking the side of Tigray and the Tigrayans against the federal government. That's not true. But that is their view. And in a number of cases, they've asserted that very forcefully. And this latest statement suggests that rather than taking responsibility for negotiating and for compromising, they're seeking to villainize leaders from the West and Western countries. Ethiopia has recently expelled a number of UN diplomats, Western diplomats, and I frankly think this is very disheartening, Christiane. This is a leader, charismatic and capable, who could be negotiating peace. He is instead accelerating his pathway towards further conflict. Neither one of these militaries is, I think, able to have a decisive military victory on the battlefield. They instead are likely to lead towards an exhausting, brutal civil war that I think could have very negative consequences. We here in the Capitol are mostly focused on passing Build Back Better, on making progress in ways that will help families across the United States, but we cannot ignore our global responsibilities as a country that cares about democracies around the world and cares about the humanitarian impact of conflict.
So, as you mentioned, you know, this is not just Ethiopia, but the spillover into Sudan. They share a border. CNN has reported that the many victims of this Ethiopian war, I mean, have literally ended up floating downriver and discovered in Sudan. So it is, you know, crossing borders. There have been skirmishes across borders. There have been soldiers killed in these border skirmishes. And does that concern you, that that could end up in a cross-border war?
Deeply. Christiane, this started as a cross-border war. Prime Minister Abiy invited the Eritrean armed forces to come into the very north and to squeeze the Tigrayan armed forces between the Ethiopian federal forces and the Eritreans. I also made a trip to a refugee camp at the far eastern border of Sudan to meet with and hear from Ethiopian refugees who had fled west across the border into Sudan and heard horrifying stories of human rights abuses. There is a hotly contested triangle of land between Sudan and Ethiopia, the Al-Fashaga Triangle, that has recently been the site of armed conflict between Sudanese and Ethiopian troops. I'm gravely concerned that this could turn into a regional conflict of even greater consequence than it already is.
So we mentioned what had just happened in Sudan with the coup, and then the ousted prime minister essentially making a deal with essentially the coup leaders to get back into power. I want to play a little bit of a section of an interview that the prime minister had with CNN on why he signed that agreement to come back to power.
There is no perfect agreement. There is a good agreement. There is a workable agreement. There is a possible agreement that would allow things to be normalized and allow the country to move forward.
Do you think it's a good agreement? I mean, there are still protesters out on the streets. They don't think it's a great agreement. Do you think it's a good agreement?
Christiane, I think that is ultimately up to the people of Sudan. I am relieved and encouraged that Prime Minister Hamdok is safe, that there is some beginnings of a path forward towards a reconciliation between civilian forces and the military, and that the coup leaders are not just driving forward. But I introduced legislation here to apply sanctions against any individual who is standing in the way of the restoration of democracy in Sudan. The Sudanese uprising against the former dictator was a truly bright spot in the last year and something that we should encourage. So I'll just say in terms of the agreement between General Burhan and Prime Minister Hamdok, I think that's up to the Sudanese people to determine, but I do think it is better that there is some lessening of the forward movement of the coup leaders.
The United States still doesn't have an official ambassador or an ambassador in Sudan. I don't know whether that will be changed anytime soon. But I want to ask you about not babysitting, nurturing the democratic process around the world, something America has done for the last many decades since the end of World War II. I'm sure you saw a troubling new report done by an NGO which should suggest that not only in the United States, but in countries aligned with the United States and allies of the United States, they are showing very significant signs of backsliding on democracy. In fact, the greatest signs of backsliding on democracy from within. How much of a, well, I mean, how does this threaten President Biden's main, international goal, which is to promote democracy?
Well, Christiane, this is part of why I have worked so hard on trying to help advance bipartisan legislation in this Congress. After the shattering, profoundly concerning developments of January 6th, the riot here in the United States Capitol, that sent a message around the world. There is no more better-known symbol of American democracy than our Capitol. And the world watched as an angry mob stormed the Capitol and sought to overturn our election results. It is important that we demonstrate the restoration of the rule of law, the impact of a peaceful and orderly transition from the previous to the current president. It's important that we show the efficacy, the vibrancy of our democracy. When President Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill in front of the White House just last week, I thought that was a big step forward. Today's bill signing is another important step forward because I think other democracies around the world for which people struggle and sacrifice in some ways look to us. And if we fail at sustaining our democracy, I think that sends a very negative message around the world. We have a great deal to learn from each other. Nations who are trying in this digital age where social media has so much impact, where climate change is destabilizing countries, we have a great deal to teach each other. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was just traveling through Africa and meeting with heads of state in European countries that are under significant pressure as there is a forward march of authoritarianism. The White House is convening a summit of democracies December 9th and 10th, and I'm looking forward to working to advance bipartisan legislation here in the Congress that will further support our global work in the effort to sustain and advance democracy around the world.
And finally, a related question, but a kind of a lessons learned question. When you see what happened in Afghanistan, the attempt to build, I guess everybody said, a Jeffersonian democracy in that country, which has come crashing down around everyone's ears, what lessons learned do you then apply to Africa, for instance? In other words, what does promoting democracy actually mean for Americans like yourself now, in wake of what happened in Afghanistan?
Well, I do think that's apples and oranges, and I'll make the argument briefly. Afghanistan had very little in the tradition of national civic infrastructure. It was an enormous effort required to try and build a nation out of a country that had known war continuously, literally for decades, and had very strong regional, tribal, and religious divisions. The United States.
But Senator, so did Ethiopia and Sudan. To be
that's
fair.
Right. And so we should recognize that if we're going to continue, as we should, to invest in democracies, to stand with young democracies, and to try and provide encouragement and support for movement in the direction of democracies, it's very difficult to do at the point of a gun. It's got to happen where the governments that we are working with, the people we are working with, are choosing it. The abrupt collapse of Afghanistan, I think, was principally a collapse of Afghan elected leadership. When President Ashraf Ghani abandoned the country, the collapse came far more swiftly than most of us expected. So, too, leaders like Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia, like General Burhan and Prime Minister Hamdok in Sudan, leaders have a significant role to play, but so, too, do the people. Without the courage and the bravery of protesters in Sudan, there would be no window for democracy in Sudan. Without civilians stepping forward, the diaspora community stepping forward and saying, we urge peace in Ethiopia, I'm not sure we can pull, or Ethiopia can pull itself back from the brink of this conflict.
Oh gosh, that sounds like quite a dark note to end on, but a realistic one. Senator Coons, thank you very much indeed.